Thanks. Actually, as a textual critic, I'm always interested in questions of textual derivation and dissemination and variation and so on. And I was really intrigued by the fact that the title of my paper exists in two separate recensions. An alpha recension disseminated from New York, and a beta recension which you have on your program and on the website of this conference. And the distinguishing characteristic of the beta recension is that it is atellus. It lacks the final phrase that occurs in the alpha recension. I thought, how appropriate. If we think of the dark archive as somehow analogous to dark matter, that some 85% of the matter of the universe as measured by gravitational attraction is invisible to any other kind of observation, then we may note and begin to describe the bulk of textual matter in our archives that is invisible to the world of named, known, and edited texts as the dark archive. I would like here, however, to draw attention to the way that texts that we think of as known are in fact also composed of dark text. And a major account of the obfuscation of this dark text is the modern critical edition. From a theoretical point of view, we may note that the critical edition, in fact, the act of editing itself, is an instance of the compulsion to recall and reinscription that Jacques Derrida characterizes as the mal d'archive, archive fever, as it is translated in the English version of his essay of that name. To quote, "It is to have a compulsive, repetitive, and nostalgic desire for the archive, an irrepressible desire to return to the origin, a homesickness, a nostalgia for the return to the most archaic place of absolute commencement." Textual scholarship in general, and editing in particular, are driven by the compulsion to recover from the archive and produce for present use the original form of the past text. But the original form of the text can never be recovered. It can only be discovered. And what the textual critic can discover, even as a wholly practical matter, is never the singularity of the original text. Like memory, it is overwritten by every attempt at recovery. As present-day neuroscience has observed, what we recall is never the original memory. What we recall is what we remember from the last time we recalled the no longer original memory. In practical terms, and particularly for medieval literature, we may note that what we hold in the archive is seldom the originary form of a text in the first place. Few surviving manuscripts are in the hand of the textual, literary manuscripts at any rate, are in the hand of the original author, or are linked with the author in terms of patronage or provenance. And even these do not necessarily provide unitary original evidence of the text. Take, for example, two of the surviving manuscripts of one text that I have edited, Nicholas Love's early 15th century Mirror of the Blessed Life of Jesus Christ, the expanded anti-Wycliffite English version of the Pseudo-Bonaventuran Meditationes Vitae Christi. One of these manuscripts, Cambridge University Library, additional manuscript 6578, belonged to Mount Grace Charterhouse in Yorkshire, where Love was prior, and was written during his priorate. The other, Yale University Beinecke Library Takamiya Deposit Manuscript 4, belonged to Joan Holland, Countess of Kent, the widow of the founder of Mount Grace, and was probably presented to her when her husband was interred before the altar there around 1410, again while Nicholas Love was prior. These two, the most closely associated manuscripts to the point of origin of Love's Mirror, represent two completely different recensions of the text. Recensions that are both probably authorial, but which differ substantially. In practical terms, we may also note that what we hold in the archive seldom represents a conscious effort at collection and preservation. In the case of medieval English texts, what we have are manuscripts of works that appealed to the interests of 17th century collectors of dispersed medieval libraries, Robert Cotton, Robert and Edward Harley, Hans Sloane, Matthew Parker, William Laud, minus, in some cases, those manuscripts that appealed to the interests of other collectors such as the works of contemplative writers like Richard Rolla and Walter Hilton that Augustine Baker requested of Robert Cotton for the reading of the English recusant nuns of Cambrai, plus manuscripts that have remained in private hands, even when, like the important Barking Abbey copy of Nicholas Love's Mirror, when it was in the hands of Christina Foyle, they break the surface of public knowledge for a short time, like a sea turtle drawing breath, then disappear again into the depths. This can have peculiar results, as I have argued before in the case of Walter Hilton's late 14th century Scale of Perfection. What survives to us probably represents particular recensions of the text better than others. That, for example, because of the reputation of the English Carthusians for sanctity, their copies of Hilton's Scale in particular are probably better preserved than other copies made for other readers, including copies textually closer to the original. Even more problematic than the fact that what is to be found in the archive is almost invariably not the originary text, providing, again, there ever was a single originary text, is the modernist compulsion to produce a simulacrum of the originary text out of what is to be found in the archive, the critical edition. Such an edition is based on a liberal humanist grand narrative of authorial creation, scribal corruption, and editorial restoration. The term critical edition is also problematic in that it has been appropriated to a particular kind of edition. Although it ought by rights to be applicable to any edition based on an analytic critical assessment of the archival evidence, the term critical edition has become applicable only to those editions that are based on the use of coincidence and shared error among the surviving witnesses to construct a stemma codicum, a family tree of books, in order to argue back through reverse genealogy to the original form from which all surviving copies descend. The ideal of textual authority is, of course, not uniquely modern. The discrimination of greater and lesser degrees of authenticity of texts and readings was already practiced in the classical world and manifested itself in various practices of control over scribal activity, up to and including the medieval monasteries and the early universities, and of course the Renaissance rediscovery and edition of classical texts. But the ability of the printing press to produce uniform copy in large volume by mechanical means, requiring a substantial capital investment in the means of production, and with profits accruing to the investors and owners of the means of production, but only on completion of a print run, the paradigm of industrial capitalism, gave a new form to both authorship and textual authority. Current day discussions of the print revolution often focus on the capacity of the printing press to produce large numbers of books for a low price. But we should pay equal attention to the capability of the press to produce uniform, authenticated, authorized text. And remember that the word auctor applied originally in Latin primarily to the authorization and not the original writing of a text. A conceptualization that neatly parallels the definition of archive derived, as Derrida notes, from the name of the residence of the authorities, the archive. In fact, printed editions have always stood in the way, blocking our view of the variation that is the natural state of text, occluding the manuscript text by its self-presentation as the unvarying representation of the real, that is, the ideal text. We should note, too, that when print was first used to produce uniform authorized text, and we should remember that the first printer's bill issued in England, Caxton's advertisement for the Sarum Ordinale of 1477, offered text that "been well and truly correct." It promised to meet a need already recognized for Bibles, liturgical books, laws, religious regulations, and university texts in manuscript. The words author and authorize are, of course, etymological twins. In the course of the development of humanist modernism, however, particularly during the period of Romanticism and after, the singular writer came to have the greatest importance, and authorized published text came to be measured by its conformity to what could be reconstructed of authorial intention. In the case of modern books that came from the hand of a known singular author, the primary question came to be whether to honor his first or his last known intention, the first or the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads, for example, or which version of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. In the case of most classical and medieval texts, for which the originals usually do not exist, the question has been how to reconstruct the authorial text from the detritus left by scribal incompetence. The critical edition is not something that actually exists in the archive. It represents the archive, but in doing so, it occludes the archive. In the centuries since the invention of movable type printed books, scholars have developed various methods for authenticating and therefore authorizing texts that have survived from former ages, primarily for classical and scriptural texts. The culmination of the exploration of methodologies in the 18th and 19th centuries, characteristic of the modern period in its dependence on the metaphor of arboriform growth, was recension. It is the recensionist edition that depends upon the identification of persistent patterns of coincident error to identify groups of manuscripts conjectured to descend from hyparchetypes in which these errors first occurred, and upon a similar conjecture of relationship among the hyparchetypes to create a stemma at the top of which stands the archetype from which all surviving copies descend. Recension implies a narrative of paternity, of descent, inheritance, and legitimation. But in a deconstruction of its own authority, recension can only establish legitimacy by focusing its attention on the identification of patterns of transmission of error, the descent of the illegitimate. It is common error, according to recension, that provides the evidence of the pattern of transmission. Nearly a century ago, Joseph Bédier, in a sarcastic aside, compared the stemmata of manuscript relations produced by recensionist analysis to un arbre qu'on a pris coutume, je ne sais pourquoi, de dessiner à l'envers, racine en haut, branche en bas. It is, as Michel Foucault points out, the working of the modern episteme that it organizes knowledge according to arboriform lineages of evolution. But stemmata are not ascending, but descending lineages. What is it that determines the orientation of the line of development? As is too often the case with Bédier, his observation that textual stemmata are customarily drawn with their point of origin at the top and their historical actualizations, the surviving manuscripts, below, is remarkably astute, but he does not analyze it. He does not ask, pourquoi? The answer is, of course, that while the teleological narrative of evolution is one of progression from lower life forms to higher, the narrative of textual descent, like that of the pedigree, the tree diagram with which the textual stemma shares its downward orientation, is one of legitimation by the elimination of bastard lineage. The flaw in the recensionist approach, according to Bédier, is that it mechanically led to the growth of stemmata where every branching was bifid. Critical theory had created a veritable forest of binary trees, silva portentosa, as he said. For the bifid inverse teleological narrative of the recensionist stemma, Bédier, and he has been followed in this by a large number of modern editors, substituted the heroic narrative of the best text, in which the base text of an edition is chosen not because of the unreconstructible vagaries of lineage, but because of historical, biographical, or philological criteria, largely peripheral to the history of the making of copies of a text from preceding copies. The authenticating narratives supporting best text editions tend to frame themselves in terms of authorial biography or of regional, dialectal, national, or institutional history. A different approach to manuscript textuality, influential particularly among scholars working in the Romance language tradition of textual criticism, but increasingly among editors working on medieval English text, is that identified with the names of Paul Zumthor and Bernard Cecchini. Zumthor and Cecchini both emphasize the tendency of manuscript tradition of medieval literature to mouvance, to variance. Both, unfortunately, found their arguments in the observation of the oral, or at least partially oral, conditions of production of medieval literature that made it particularly susceptible to variation, rather than, more appropriately, I believe, observing, and this is important, that variation is the normal state of text, which is only artificially and partially at best inhibited by print. The greatest influence on the practice of editing medieval English texts in the past half-century, however, derives from the narrative of massive, inevitable, willful, when not simply obtuse, scribal corruption, a degree of textual corruption that only the most perceptive of textual critics can attempt fully to repair, a narrative of corruption that underpins the Athlone edition of Piers Plowman, where recension depends upon the delineation of paternity and best text editing upon a historical or biographical narrative. The editorial stance taken by George Kane and those associated with him in the Piers Plowman project is best characterized by one of its proponents as the way of genius. For it is a narrative of the recovery by critical conjecture of the mind of the poet, which had been lost in the scribal corruption of the text. Edition is no longer a process based on physical evidence. It is a meeting on a higher plane of the superior minds of the poet and critic. Where earlier strictures for the identification of textual error had been founded on observations about the physical process of copying a text, conjectural criticism is based in a new critical aesthetic sensibility that functions entirely within the mind of the critic and can lead to editions that contradict all of the manuscript evidence. This is where modern textual criticism shows itself most similar to grand historical narrative. In support of the telos toward which it aims and its consistency as a narrative, it requires the critic to substitute his account of what must have been for the actual data that survive. The problem of the tendency of critical edition to occlude the manuscript evidence on which it is based is, of course, not peculiar to the conjectural method of the Athlone Piers Plowman. In producing the recensionist full critical edition of Nicholas Love's Mirror, surviving in 49 manuscripts and early prints, an edition based on the alpha text manuscript, Here. Next slide. The alpha text manuscript, Cambridge University Library, edition 6578. That's A1, fourth one down in the left-hand column. I corrected away some 300 variants characteristic of all alpha manuscripts, but which the beta and gamma manuscripts, which together agreed with the underlying Latin text of the Meditationes where applicable, showed to be erroneous. In doing so, I created a text of the Mirror of which Nicholas Love may well have approved, but which may not have existed in his day. This is the nature of the modern critical edition. It is a chimera of uniform authorized text, a construct of the collusion of the editor and the printer. The more perfect it is, the more fully it counterfeits the manuscript evidence upon which it is based. By whatever method, the purpose of the modern critical editor has thus always been to distinguish true readings from false, the authentic from the erroneous, to enshrine the true in the critical text, and to banish the erroneous to the critical apparatus, or not to print them at all. Yet neither authenticity nor error exists prior to the editor's work of discrimination. They are both projections of the editor's judgment on the material before him or her. Certainly there are readings that are erroneous in the sense that no one would expect an intelligent, non-satiric author to misspell the words he uses, granted the vagaries of late Middle English orthography, to commit grammatical errors, or otherwise to write nonsense. One should think that sentences without verbs, or explications of the Ten Commandments lacking a crucial "not" following the phrase "thou shalt," were probably not what their authors intended. The vast majority of textual variations in late medieval vernacular prose, however, are not as clear to decide as that. The editor may also wish to exclude from consideration as authorial forms that vary from an author's known dialect, although the author's dialect is usually known from the text under study. But despite the sometimes pontifical affirmations of some editors of their own inerrancy, and the multiplication of rules for distinguishing both conscious and unconscious forms of scribal corruption of the text, the discrimination of true from false readings is usually a matter of the editor's sense of the author's voice, a fallible instrument at best. For the majority of textual variants, the most that can be said is that to the editor who has the experience of reading many surviving copies of a medieval text, some variants are more cogent than others. But in the end, the text presented by the modern printed critical edition, whether produced by recension or by modernist aestheticist conjecture, is not something that actually exists in the archive. It represents the archive in the Deleuzian sense of representation, but in doing so, it occludes the difference, again in the Deleuzian sense, that constitutes the archive. A different tradition of textual presentation, much derided by the critical editors of the German philological tradition at the end of the 19th century, but employed in a number of prominent publications of the founders of the early English Text Society, was the printing of multiple variant versions of first texts in parallel columns. Capitalizing on his own egalitarian values while making a virtue of the fact that England in the late 19th century did not have the cadre of university-trained philologists to produce critical editions according to the criteria of the German school, F.J. Furnivall led an effort through the Early English Text Society and the Chaucer Society to produce diplomatic editions of all the earliest and best manuscripts of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Piers Plowman, or at least sample sections of their text, in ledger book format where possible. Furnivall's 6-text Canterbury Tales, eventually expanded to include 2 more manuscripts. There's a verb missing in that sentence. There must be a scribal error. And Furnivall also published the separate narrative units of the tales in no fewer than 43 volumes. The culmination of this work, as well as parallel work on Chaucer's other works, was Walter Skeat's Complete Works of Geoffrey Chaucer. Skeat himself published 2 sets of extracts from Piers Plowman for comparison, one of 29 manuscripts and another of 45, and 3 separate editions of the A, B, and C versions of the text before producing his final 3-text edition. The publication of various versions of Canterbury Tales, Piers Plowman, Curso Mundi, Ancona Wisse in the late 19th and 20th centuries all function as multiple best text editions with minimal representation of the variant readings of other manuscripts. They provide an example of an alternative to the grand narrative of the critical edition, a set of local narratives of the textuality of a given work. They realize Furnivall's egalitarian ideal that every reader should be his own amateur textual critic. At the same time, a number of the early editions based on partial surveys of the surviving manuscripts have eventually been replaced by more critical modern editions. In the most prominent edition of a Middle English work to acknowledge the tendency of medieval text to mouvance, Bella Millett's 2005 EETS edition of Ancona Wisse points particularly to the great deal of variation, including probable authorial intervention, shown among the manuscripts of the, and I'm quoting her, dynamic textual tradition of a work of practical instruction in the religious life, in manuscripts copied over a period of more than 2 centuries, and translated as well from the English original into French and Latin. Millett's solution was to produce not a recensionist critical text, but a corrected edition based on Cambridge Corpus Christi College Manuscript 402 that presents a historical text. Equally, on the other side, there has been an editorial tendency on the part even of editors who espouse recension to pare back on the presentation or even the collation of the evidence of manuscripts that do not contribute to the construction and support of the critical text. Margaret Connolly's 2010 EETS recensionist critical edition of Contemplations of the Dread and Love of God, for example, a variable text comprising 24 chapters, several of which occur independently in varying numbers of manuscripts, was based on a collation of the 15 surviving originally complete manuscripts and one incunable print. The Contemplations, however, is equally represented by 25 manuscripts comprising extracts ranging from one to several chapters. These were not collated. It should also be noted that the tendency of a number of recent series of editions of Middle English texts, the Garland series, the Heidelberg series, the Exeter series, the Teams series, are all best text editions, in which one manuscript is chosen from the archive to speak for all. In the recent EETS edition of the second book of Walter Hilton's Scale of Perfection, which survives in 22 manuscripts and a series of early prints, I printed a text based on British Library manuscript Harley 6573, a manuscript that my predecessor, Stan Hussey, had dismissed for recensionist reasons as an inaccurate copy of the less authoritative of the two textual families into which he saw the manuscripts as falling, precisely as Bedier noted was the tendency of such editions. Right. A complete new collation of the manuscripts demonstrated rather that there are 8 probable lines of transmission of the text of Scale 2, and that Harley 6573, that's H7 over there on the left, where am I? Differs less often from the consensus of all manuscripts and is closer than any other to the original from which the Carmelite friar Thomas Fishlake, who probably knew Hilton at Cambridge, was made. I still corrected the text. It was suggested to me that after 40-odd years of sporadically reading Hilton and 10 years of collating the manuscripts of Scale 2, I probably had a pretty good sense of Hilton's voice. But I did not correct the text when I found the readings of the other manuscripts, even all the other manuscripts, more cogent. Only when I felt that the reading of Harley 6573 was false to English grammar or to Hilton's meaning. I still corrected the text some 200 times, but every reading of every manuscript is registered in the critical apparatus. In making these decisions, I was consciously addressing the issue of what a postmodern edition would look like in a paper rather than an electronic format. But the fundamental opposition remains. The printed modern critical edition can only, in Deleuzian terms, represent the medieval text. It is not the text, but a simulacrum erected between the text and the reader. It may be an entirely credible simulacrum, but it is not the text. Only the specific manuscript instantiations of the text, each one a repetition of another or others before it, in all their difference, are the text. And difference is precisely what the modern critical edition aims to suppress. Even a best text edition is not the text as such, because it presents a single instantiation shorn of its location in the textual matrix, privileged by the editor as a representative of the others. But this is a problem inherent in the print medium. It invariably privileges a particular form of the text. Only an electronic edition based on a complete transcription and collation of all manuscripts would be able to report all of this evidence. But without some sort of editorial method, it would be equal in size to the archive that it records. On the other hand, a truly postmodern edition might only be possible in some rhizomorphic electronic form that would base itself upon all surviving manuscript material and would make all of that material available to the reader simultaneously under the guidance of the editor. But even such an electronic edition would still privilege the default form of the text, the form that appears on screen when the edition is booted up. Either by the unmitigated presentation of an electronic text that is simply a copy of the entirety of the archive of the text, or by editorial selection of one text that represents the archive of the text, the edition deconstructs itself. Of current electronic editorial projects in Middle English literature, the Piers Plowman Electronic Archive, headed by the late Hoyt Duggan, has produced 7 single manuscript transmissions out of a total of some 45 manuscripts over the course of several decades. The markup codes are incredible, word by word, and a recensionist critical edition of the B10. Electronic textual capabilities have been employed in the word-by-word markup of the text. The Canterbury Tales project, headed by Peter Robinson, on the other hand, is intended to produce an electronic version of recension in which the characteristic binary methodology of recension is embedded in the coding of its cladistic program. Going forward, in my view, scholars producing postmodern electronic editions should take as their ultimate goal the presentation of the complete archive of the text, images, and transcript, with links for material composition, scribal hand, dialect, provenance, concurrence with other texts in the same manuscript, and ownership history, and probably other things that I wasn't thinking of. The edition should open up to a default text and its apparatus. The choice and presentation of this text is still the work of the editor as the single most experienced reader. But other readers should also be able to flip the text to see to see it in any of its manuscript instantiations, each with its own apparatus, that is, truly flip the text. This would require both software that would allow any entry in the critical apparatus to become the base text for an alternative reading, and the complete transcript of every manuscript of the text, linked, of course, to the actual manuscripts. A couple of examples. This is an attempt to model the display of textual affiliations of the manuscripts of the text of Walter Hilton's Scale of Perfection, the first and second books of which, the left and right sides, have different patterns of transmission. I would want to see this diagram mapped onto the surface of a rugby ball-shaped ovoid, or better yet, half of an ovoid with a scale 2 pattern, the right-hand side of the present chart, nested inside the scale 1 pattern, separated by an amount of space that would represent the probable 20 years between the dates of composition of the two books. And here, right, is a map of the relations, a Gephi map like we saw yesterday. Here is a map of the relations of the various forms of connection, ownership and documentation, author, institution, manuscript, personal place, and textual affiliation of a single manuscript of Nicholas Love's Mirror, produced by Stephen Kelly and Ryan Perry, then both at Queen's College Belfast, for a proposed project intended to map in this way all of the manuscripts survived by the HSRC-funded Geographies of Orthodoxy project. Both of these representations are two-dimensional. I would envisage them, actually most of the things we've seen so far have been two-dimensional. We're still thinking paper. I would envisage the nodes of an electronic text that included all of this information rather as arcologies, to borrow a term from William Gibson's Neuromancer novels, in a three-dimensional cyberspace on which a reader could dock and among which they could navigate as their curiosity took them. Such an edition would thus be one face of the exploration of the dark archive. In such an edition, the default text should be thought of not as the text, occluding its silent brethren, or glancing back like Orpheus to see Eurydice disappearing into the darkness, it should be the form of the text that the editor suggests as the one person who has searched furthest in the archive that the reader see first. Finally, keep in mind that I am not arguing that resources should be diverted from the exploration of those parts of the archive that at this point are still truly dark, but that we should remain aware that darkness also resides in the clean, well-lighted places in which we think ourselves already familiar.